Sergeant Rachel Miller was no stranger to tough situations. She'd seen it all, the blood, the chaos, the fear, but nothing could have prepared her for what she found on the empty stretch of road that day. A puppy, small and golden, sat trembling beside the highway, eyes wide with terror. Rachel's heart sank. She'd seen that kind of fear before, and it wasn't the kind of fear you see in animals. This puppy wasn't just scared, it was desperate. "Hey there, little one," Rachel muttered to herself as she slammed on the brakes. Her military vehicle screeched to a halt on the asphalt, the tires kicking up a cloud of dust as she shifted into park. She pulled the door open and stepped outside, her boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. The puppy didn't move. It just sat there, staring at her with those big, frightened eyes, its small body shaking. She knew better than to assume everything would be fine. This wasn't just some stray dog wandering onto the road. This was a dog in trouble, real trouble. She stepped closer, speaking softly to the puppy. "It's okay. I've got you." Rachel bent down and gently scooped the puppy into her arms. The little dog fit perfectly against her chest, still trembling but now comforted by her touch. She looked around. There was no one in sight, just an open stretch of road leading into nothingness. And then she saw it. Further down the road, attached to a weathered metal pole, was another dog, a much larger dog, a golden retriever. But this one had something wrapped around its head, a black plastic bag, secured tightly by a rope. Rachel's heart lurched in her chest. What kind of person does this to an animal? She immediately walked toward the older dog, her boots crunching against the gravel as she made her way down the road. The older dog's eyes were wide with fear, but there was also something else, something that made Rachel stop dead in her tracks. The older dog didn't bark. It didn't growl. It just stared at her, as if it knew her, as if it recognized that she was its only hope. With shaking hands, Rachel untied the rope from the pole. The dog's head came free from the bag, and Rachel was relieved to see that the dog was still alive, though barely. It was thin, its fur matted with dirt and patches of blood. The skin underneath looked raw, as if it had been abused. She knelt down, gently running her hand over the dog's fur. "It's okay," she whispered. "I'm not going to let anything happen to you." The dog didn't respond, but it didn't move either. It seemed to understand that it was safe now. With the two dogs in tow, Rachel made her way back to the vehicle, her mind racing. Who would do this? Why were these dogs out here, left for dead on the side of the road? The puppy, Max, had already found comfort in her arms, but Buddy, the older dog, seemed distant, like it didn't trust anyone anymore. She carefully placed them in the back seat of the vehicle and slid into the driver's seat. The whole ride back to base felt surreal. The puppy, Max, was quiet now, curling up in the seat and resting his head on her lap. Buddy, on the other hand, remained alert, watching her with wary eyes. "Don't worry," Rachel muttered, staring at the road ahead. "I'm not leaving you two alone. You're safe now." But something gnawed at her, a feeling she couldn't shake. She had saved them, sure, but what had brought these dogs out here in the first place? And why were they left like this? It wasn't until she got back to base and took the dogs to the medical unit that she started noticing the signs. Things she hadn't seen before. Max was covered in scars. Not just the kind you get from a rough life. These were precise, intentional marks. As Rachel gently probed at one of the wounds, she found something strange. A mark on the side of his neck. It wasn't a scar. It was a brand. The kind you'd put on an animal for identification, but this one was different. Rachel's brow furrowed. She'd seen this kind of thing before, but it was never good. She couldn't place it, but it was as if Max had been marked for something. Something darker than a stray dog trying to survive. Buddy, too, had wounds, old ones. His body was covered in scars. But unlike Max, Buddy didn't show any signs of fear. He just watched Rachel with an intensity that made her uneasy. "Where did you two come from?" Rachel whispered, looking from one dog to the other. The more she thought about it, the more it didn't make sense. The dogs were clearly survivors of something horrible. But what? And why had they ended up on the side of the road like this? That night, as Rachel sat in her small quarters on base, flipping through her medical notes, she heard a soft whimper. She froze, her pen midair. She hadn't heard anything like that before. It was Max, the puppy. He was standing near the window, staring outside, his body tense, his eyes darting around like he was expecting something. Rachel stood up and walked over to him, kneeling down to comfort him. But as soon as her hand touched him, Max spun around, his eyes wide with panic. Something wasn't right. She opened the door and peered into the night. There was nothing. But Max's nervous energy didn't go away. It only grew stronger, his eyes still fixed on something out there in the dark. Rachel stepped back inside and glanced over at Buddy, who was sitting silently in the corner, watching her with that same unblinking gaze. "You feel it too, don't you?" she whispered. Buddy's tail twitched ever so slightly, but he didn't move. He just stayed there, staring. It was then that Rachel realized they weren't alone. Max's behavior wasn't just from being scared. It wasn't just a puppy in need of comfort. There was something more, something he was afraid of. Suddenly, the door slammed shut. Rachel whipped around, her heart pounding. She rushed to the door, throwing it open. But there was no one there, just the empty, quiet night. But Rachel knew she wasn't imagining it. Someone had been out there. Someone had been watching. Her heart raced. Who were these dogs really? And why did they seem so afraid? Rachel didn't know it yet, but this was just the beginning. The mystery of these dogs was only about to unfold, and it would take her down a path she never expected. And Max, the puppy that had begged for her help? He wasn't just a stray. He had a past, one that was far darker than Rachel could ever have imagined. But who would stop at nothing to find them? And why? Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that the past few days had set something in motion, something she wasn't ready for. Every time she closed her eyes, Max's terrified face was all she saw. There was a quiet urgency in his gaze, as if he was begging her for something more than just safety. He was begging for protection, but from what? That night, after the eerie silence and the unsettling feeling of being watched, Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. Max's strange behavior, Buddy's guarded silence, and the unmistakable sense of danger that had followed them back to base. It wasn't just paranoia. She knew something was off, and she had a feeling that the answers weren't going to come easy. The next morning, Rachel went to the medical unit, where she had the dogs settled. Max had calmed down for the most part, but his eyes still darted nervously around the room. Buddy, on the other hand, stayed silent, his watchful gaze never leaving Rachel. The older dog didn't act like a stray. There was something more about him, like he had a mission. Rachel examined Max again, this time looking more closely at the brand on his neck. It wasn't just a marking. It was a military symbol, the kind she'd seen on covert operation uniforms, on soldiers she had worked with during her deployments. This wasn't just a stray puppy. This was an animal that had been involved in something far more dangerous than Rachel could have ever anticipated. She needed answers. Let me take you back to where it all began. Rachel found herself searching through every file, every document, anything that might explain the symbol on Max's neck. She had a hunch, and that hunch was pushing her to look into covert military operations. But as she sat there, going through the military databases, she found something that sent a chill down her spine. Max wasn't just part of any military operation. He had been part of an abandoned program, a covert project involving animals trained for warfare. The project had been shut down years ago, but the animals? They had been abandoned, left to fend for themselves, as if they were just tools to be discarded when the mission was over. Rachel felt sick. How could something like this happen? How could they use these animals and just toss them away like they were nothing? She couldn't understand it, but she had to know more. She had to understand what happened, and what had led Max and Buddy to her. Rachel's hands trembled as she scrolled through the files. The program was meant to train animals for intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and even combat support. Max, the puppy she had rescued, had been one of the first subjects in the program. He had been trained to be smart, fast, and obedient. And the brand? It was an identification mark, one that showed the project's ownership over him. But the deeper she dug, the more troubling the information became. The program had been terminated after a disastrous incident. Animals had been abandoned, and not all of them had been lucky enough to survive. Rachel sat back, her head spinning. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Max wasn't just a scared puppy. He had been through things no animal, no living being should ever endure. He was a survivor. And Buddy? Buddy had been his protector, guarding him through the horrors of whatever had happened in that program. But there was one question Rachel couldn't answer yet. Why had Max and Buddy been abandoned? Who had left them there on the side of the road? And who was still out there watching them? As she stared at the screen, Rachel heard a faint sound, a soft whimper from the next room. Rachel immediately stood up and walked toward the medical room where the dogs were resting. When she opened the door, she found Max standing near the window, staring out at the empty parking lot. His tail was stiff, his ears flat against his head. "Max," Rachel whispered softly, kneeling down beside him. "What is it, boy?" Max turned to her, his eyes wide with fear. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just stared at her, his little body shaking. Rachel's heart ached for him. She wanted to tell him everything was going to be okay, but she didn't know if that was true. All she knew was that there was something out there, something that was coming for them. Buddy, who had been lying quietly in the corner, suddenly stood up, his body tense. He walked over to Rachel and Max, sitting down beside them. He didn't make a sound, but his presence was enough. He was alert. He was ready. Rachel felt a sense of calm wash over her, as if Buddy's silence and strength were telling her that they were in this together. She wasn't alone in this fight. But just as she was about to reach for Max, there was a knock at the door. Rachel froze. She wasn't expecting anyone. Not this late. She stood up, her hand instinctively reaching for the small handgun she kept in her drawer. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Sergeant Miller," a voice called from the other side. "We need to talk." It was Lieutenant Harris. Rachel didn't lower her weapon, but she did open the door. Harris stood there, his face serious. "I need you to come with me," Harris said, his voice low. "We have a problem." Rachel's stomach dropped. She knew this wasn't just some routine call. This was something serious. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice steady despite the racing thoughts in her head. "We've got a situation," Harris said, his eyes flicking nervously over her shoulder toward the dogs. "It's about the dogs you brought in." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. "What about them?" Harris hesitated, glancing around before speaking. "We've received word that there's a group looking for them. A rogue operation. They know we have them." Rachel's blood ran cold. The rogue group. The same group she had been fearing ever since she first found Max and Buddy. "What do you mean they know we have them?" Rachel demanded, stepping closer to Harris. "How do they know? We haven't told anyone." "I don't know," Harris said, his voice tense. "But they're coming, and we need to be ready." Rachel's mind raced. The walls felt like they were closing in. She couldn't let these dogs fall into the hands of those people. Not after everything they had been through. "I'm not letting them take them," she said firmly, her voice shaking with a mix of fear and determination. Harris looked at her, his expression hardening. "We're going to need help. This is bigger than just you and me." Rachel didn't have time to argue. She knew what had to be done. She had to protect Max and Buddy, no matter what it took. As Harris walked away to get the rest of the team, Rachel stood in the doorway, her heart pounding. She glanced back at the two dogs, who were now looking up at her with wide, trusting eyes. The truth was clear now. They weren't just survivors, they were part of something that could tear her apart. But Rachel wasn't about to let that happen. They had made it this far together, and together they would fight to stay free. But what would happen when the rogue group arrived? Rachel didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. The thought of the rogue group closing in on them gnawed at her. She wasn't about to let Max and Buddy fall back into the hands of the people who had abused them, who had used them like tools. They were more than that. They were family now. She glanced over at the two dogs, curled up together in the corner of the room. "Max," still young and innocent, lay with his head resting on Buddy's paws. Buddy, the older dog, kept his eyes wide open, always alert, always watching. They had been through things Rachel couldn't even begin to understand. But in that moment, she knew one thing. They trusted her, and she would not let them down. Rachel went over her options. She had a small team at the base, people she trusted. But this wasn't a military operation she could simply run like one of the countless missions she had been on before. This was personal. This was about keeping these dogs safe, even if it meant facing down the people who were after them. She glanced at the clock. It was nearly 2 a.m., and still, she hadn't heard from Harris or anyone else on her team. She felt the pressure building. If she waited any longer, the rogue group would be on them before they could put a plan together. She pulled out her phone, staring at the numbers. She didn't want to make that call, but she had to. She dialed her friend and fellow soldier, Sergeant Daniel Carter, someone she could trust with her life. "Carter," she said when he picked up, her voice low but urgent. "I need you and your team here. Now." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a grunt of recognition. "What's going on, Rachel?" "They're coming for the dogs. I need you to get here as fast as you can. We don't have much time." Carter didn't ask questions. "We'll be there in 20 minutes. Hang tight." Rachel ended the call and walked over to the dogs. Max raised his head, looking at her with those wide, vulnerable eyes. She knelt down, her hand gently stroking his fur. "It's going to be okay, Max," she whispered. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you again." Buddy, ever the protector, stood up and walked over to Rachel. He didn't nuzzle her or wag his tail. He simply stood there, watching her with a look of quiet understanding. Rachel had been through countless missions. But this was different. She wasn't just fighting for herself, for the mission. She was fighting for them, Max and Buddy, and that made all the difference. 20 minutes later, Carter and his team arrived. Rachel rushed outside to meet them, her heart racing. The urgency in the air was palpable, but she knew she had to stay focused. This wasn't a time to panic. Carter got out of the truck first, his face grim. "You're sure they're coming for them?" Rachel nodded. "The word's out. They know we have them, and they won't stop until they get them back." She paused, glancing back at the building. "These dogs are more than just strays, Carter. They're part of something bigger, something darker." Carter's eyes softened as he looked at her. "We'll do whatever it takes, Rachel. You've got my team." Rachel swallowed hard, trying to steady her nerves. She couldn't afford to be scared now, not when Max and Buddy were counting on her. "We need to set up defenses. Secure the area. They'll be here soon." As her team got to work, Rachel and Carter moved inside, making sure Max and Buddy were ready to be moved to a safer area. Max, who had once been a nervous wreck, was now sitting calmly, sensing that something big was happening. Buddy, however, was pacing, as if he could already sense the danger that was closing in on them. "We can't keep them here much longer," Carter said, glancing out the window. "We need to get them to a safer location, somewhere they'll never think to look." Rachel nodded, already thinking of the old cabin out in the woods. It wasn't far, and it had been used for shelter during training missions before. It wasn't ideal, but it was the best option they had. "We'll move out in 30 minutes, she said. "Get everything ready. Don't let anyone out of your sight." Carter gave her a quick nod and turned to his team, shouting out orders. Rachel grabbed a few essentials, making sure she had everything they needed for the move, including medical supplies for the dogs in case anything went wrong. Max and Buddy were settled into a travel crate, ready for the move, but Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As she stood in the hallway, looking at the dogs, she could feel it. The same gut-wrenching feeling she had felt the night she found them. They weren't just running from the rogue group. They were running from a past that had followed them here. And the longer they stayed at the base, the more danger they were in. The drive to the cabin was tense. Rachel could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her. The team was quiet, eyes darting from side to side, alert for any sign of movement. Max and Buddy were silent in the back, their bodies close together, comforting each other as much as they could. Rachel couldn't help but glance back at them every few seconds, checking to make sure they were okay. "Do you think they'll follow us?" Carter asked, breaking the silence. Rachel nodded slowly. "They'll come. They've tracked us before. It's what they do." They arrived at the cabin just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the land. Rachel quickly unloaded the dogs and led them inside. The cabin was small but sturdy, tucked away deep in the woods. It wasn't the kind of place anyone would think to search, and that was exactly why Rachel had chosen it. Carter set up a perimeter, while the rest of the team began reinforcing the doors and windows. Rachel made sure Max and Buddy were comfortable in a small corner of the cabin, surrounded by blankets and a few bowls of water. The dogs seemed to relax, though Rachel could see the unease in their eyes. They knew what was coming, just as she did. Rachel sat down next to them, taking a deep breath. She wasn't sure how much time they had left, but she knew it wasn't long. "I'll protect you," she whispered to Max and Buddy, her voice trembling. "I promise." It didn't take long for the first sign of trouble to appear. Rachel had just begun to settle into a routine when she heard it. Footsteps in the distance. Slow, deliberate, like they were being watched. Rachel's heart raced. "They're here," she muttered to herself. She grabbed her weapon and motioned for the team to fall into position. "Stay sharp. Stay quiet." But it was too late. The door slammed open with a violent crash, and a man stepped through. His face was obscured by a dark mask, but Rachel recognized the silhouette. It was one of them, the rogue group. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," the man said, his voice cold and calculated. "This was never supposed to be your fight." Rachel raised her weapon, her fingers trembling but determined. "I'm not going to let you take them." The man stepped forward, his hand reaching for something hidden beneath his jacket. "Then I guess we'll see just how far you're willing to go." Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. The battle for Max and Buddy's freedom had only just begun, and she knew there was no turning back now. The rogue soldier's words echoed in Rachel's mind as he stepped forward, his eyes cold, his hand moving under his jacket with a dangerous ease. Every muscle in Rachel's body tensed as she tightened her grip on her weapon. This wasn't just another mission. This wasn't something she could handle with the usual tactics and discipline she'd learned in combat. This was personal. This was about Max and Buddy, and there was no way in hell she was going to let anyone hurt them. "Stay back," Rachel called out, her voice sharp. "I won't let you take them." The man stopped, just at the threshold of the cabin door, his gaze flicking to the side, towards the shadows where Max and Buddy lay. They had heard the noise, too, their bodies stiff, their eyes wide with fear. Max whined softly, and Rachel could see the way Buddy's body shifted, ready to defend the puppy no matter what. The rogue soldier smirked, taking another step forward. "You don't understand. These dogs are property. You've become involved in something you can't comprehend." Rachel felt her chest tighten with fury. She wasn't going to let him talk like that about Max and Buddy. These were living beings, not objects to be discarded or controlled. They were survivors just like her, and she would fight to the death to protect them. "Don't make me repeat myself," Rachel said, her voice low and steady, though she felt the surge of adrenaline making her heart race. "Stay away from them." She heard a sound behind her, and without turning, she knew it was Carter, silently moving into position, his team ready. He had brought reinforcements, but Rachel knew this fight would be just as much about holding her ground as it was about strategy. The rogue soldier's eyes narrowed, and he took a slow, deliberate step into the cabin. "You're making a mistake, Sergeant. This is bigger than you. You've already gone too far. You're about to get more people killed than just your team." Rachel's throat tightened, but her resolve didn't waver. If anyone's going to die today, it won't be them. It won't be Max and Buddy. At that, something shifted in the man's eyes. He reached for something in his jacket. A gun, perhaps, or some kind of device. But before he could move further, a sharp crack broke through the silence. Rachel's body reacted before her mind could even process the sound. The rogue soldier collapsed onto the floor with a grunt, the weapon he was reaching for skittering across the floor. Rachel's eyes darted to Carter, who had taken the shot from the shadows. He stood there, his expression unreadable, his gun still raised. "Take him out," Carter said quietly. "We're not letting them get away with this." Rachel nodded, her chest still tight, but now she had a moment's peace, however brief. She couldn't allow herself to be distracted, though. There was still a danger lurking, and she could feel it in the pit of her stomach. She moved quickly, pulling the soldier into a corner and checking for any other signs of intrusion. Meanwhile, Carter and his team began securing the area, making sure no one else had slipped in. Max and Buddy were still huddled in their corner, eyes wide, their bodies trembling. Rachel's heart ached as she approached them. "It's okay," she whispered, kneeling down beside them. "You're safe now." But even as she said the words, Rachel knew it wasn't over yet. They had just started the fight, but there was more to come. The rogue group wouldn't stop at one soldier. They would send more. And Rachel couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of a much bigger war. Later that night, Rachel and her team huddled around a small campfire outside the cabin. The forest around them was dark, the only sounds being the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. The cabin was silent, but Rachel knew the stillness wouldn't last. The rogue group would regroup and they'd be back. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. She couldn't afford to feel safe. As the night dragged on, Carter sat beside her, staring into the fire. His face was hardened, as it always was in moments like these, but Rachel could see the worry in his eyes. "I didn't think they'd come for them," Carter said after a long pause. "You think this is just the beginning?" Rachel's jaw clenched. "They're after Max and Buddy because they know what they are. They're part of something bigger than we realize, and I'm not about to let them take them back. Not after everything they've been through." "I get it," Carter said, "but you're not the only one they're after. They'll keep coming, Rachel. We need a plan." Rachel nodded, her eyes never leaving the fire. "We'll have a plan, but we need to keep moving. I'm not staying in one place for too long. I'm not risking their lives for my own comfort." Carter sighed. "I'll back you up, but I need you to know that we can't keep running forever." "I'm not running," Rachel replied firmly. "I'm protecting them, and I won't stop until they're safe." The next day, Rachel and her team packed up the cabin. They moved quickly and quietly, but Rachel's heart was heavy. She knew that they couldn't stay ahead of the rogue group forever. Sooner or later, they'd catch up. And when they did, Rachel had no idea what would happen. She glanced at Max and Buddy, who were now quietly following her, their eyes still watchful, their instincts still on high alert. They knew the stakes. They could feel the danger as much as she did. As they made their way deeper into the woods, Rachel found herself wondering what had led them to this point. How had Max and Buddy ended up in the hands of people who used them as weapons? What had happened to them in the dark corners of the world? But now, as she looked at them, she knew one thing. They weren't victims anymore. They were fighters just like her. They were family, and family didn't back down. Hours later, the team set up camp in a secluded area, far away from the roads and paths they had once traveled. Rachel could feel the weight of the decision in her bones, the pressure mounting as she considered the next move. She knew they were out there. The rogue group had eyes everywhere, and they would eventually find them. But this time, Rachel was ready. Max and Buddy lay on the ground beside her, the firelight dancing on their fur. Rachel reached out and petted Buddy's head, feeling the calmness that only a dog who had been through the worst could bring. Max curled up beside Buddy, his small body still trembling, but his eyes were filled with trust. "They won't get you," Rachel whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I promise." The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Her hand immediately went to her weapon, and her heart raced. But it was Carter. He had a grim look on his face as he approached her. "We have a problem," he said, his voice low. "They're closing in." Rachel stood, ready for whatever came next. The night was far from over, and the battle for Max and Buddy's survival was just beginning. But Rachel knew one thing. She wasn't giving up. Not now, not ever. The night air was thick with tension. The campfire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows that danced unnaturally across the trees. Rachel could feel it in her gut. The rogue group was getting closer. It wasn't just the sound of the wind shifting or the distant rustle of leaves. It was a deep, gnawing sense that the quiet around her was only temporary, like the calm before a storm. As Carter approached, his face set in grim determination, Rachel's instincts flared. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. "We have a problem," Carter said, his voice low but firm. "They've found us. They've been tracking our movements and they're not far off. We need to move now." Rachel's pulse quickened. She knew this wasn't a drill. This wasn't a military exercise or a routine patrol. The stakes had never been higher. Max and Buddy were everything now. She wouldn't let them fall into the hands of those who had abandoned them, those who had turned them into tools for a twisted agenda. "Where?" Rachel asked, her voice steady despite the storm of thoughts racing through her mind. "About a mile west," Carter replied, pointing into the dense woods. "They've got a unit on the ground. We're surrounded." Rachel's heart hammered in her chest. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "We can't outrun them. We fight. We stay here and fight." Carter's eyes narrowed, his brow furrowing. "Are you sure? We're outnumbered. We'll lose the element of surprise." Rachel shook her head, her hand instinctively reaching for her weapon. "We don't have a choice. We protect them. We make our stand here. We're not running anymore." "I won't run." Carter looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, we'll make it work. We'll hold our ground." Rachel's thoughts turned to Max and Buddy, who had been resting by her side. She knew Buddy was ready to fight. He had always been the protective one. Max, though, was still a puppy, innocent and scared. Rachel hated the thought of him being caught in the crossfire, but there was no other choice. "Get the team ready," Rachel ordered, her voice firm and resolute. "Set up defenses. We need to create a perimeter, secure the area. Carter, make sure the dogs are inside the cabin, and keep them hidden." Carter gave her a nod and quickly moved to organize the team. Rachel moved to Max and Buddy, kneeling down beside them. Max looked up at her, his big eyes wide with uncertainty. Buddy sat quietly, his head slightly tilted as he studied the surrounding woods. "We're going to make it through this," Rachel whispered to them both, her voice barely audible. "I promise." The fight came sooner than expected. As the team set up their positions around the cabin, the sound of footsteps and crackling branches echoed in the trees. Rachel's pulse raced as she checked her weapon one last time, ensuring it was loaded and ready. "Stay low," she ordered her team. "If we can take out their scouts first, we might stand a chance." The night was now pitch black, save for the faint glow of the campfire that was rapidly dying out. Rachel could hear the faint crunch of leaves and the distant murmur of voices. They were close, too close. "We've got company," one of her soldiers, Private Dawson, whispered over the comms. "2 men, coming in from the east." Rachel didn't hesitate. "Take them out silently," she ordered. A few moments passed, and then the faint sound of muffled gunshots cracked through the night. The first 2 soldiers were down, but Rachel knew that wouldn't stop them. The rogue group wasn't here for a quick fight. They were here for Max and Buddy. The cabin was quiet now, too quiet. Rachel could feel the air thickening with the impending danger. Every second that passed, she could hear the footsteps getting closer, feel the weight of their presence. It was only a matter of time before they made their move. Then, all at once, it exploded. The first burst of gunfire came from the south side, followed by a barrage of noise from every direction. Rachel ducked behind a tree, firing back at the shadows. Her training kicked in, and she moved with precision, keeping her head low, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Buddy and Max were still inside the cabin, but Rachel could feel their presence with her. Buddy's instincts were sharp, and Rachel trusted him to stay calm. She just needed to hold out long enough to protect them. The rogue group was using the cover of darkness to their advantage, but Rachel's team was ready. The firefight was intense, and for every soldier that came into view, Rachel was there, taking them down. Her shots were precise, her movements fast. She was no stranger to combat, but this was different. It was personal. "Keep it up, everyone," Rachel shouted over the gunfire. "We can't let them breach the cabin." She glanced over her shoulder and saw Carter move to the opposite side of the cabin, where the enemy had been trying to flank them. His shots rang out and another soldier dropped. But just as Rachel thought they had the upper hand, a sharp pain shot through her leg. She stumbled, gasping for air as the blood began to pour from the wound. "Rachel!" Carter yelled, rushing toward her. She waved him off, gritting her teeth. "I'm fine. Just keep fighting." But Rachel could feel the world spinning, and as she attempted to stand, her vision blurred. She needed to stay in control. She needed to fight. Max and Buddy were counting on her. Another wave of gunfire ripped through the night, and Rachel ducked, her heart pounding. She knew they couldn't hold out forever. The rogue group was relentless, and the sound of reinforcements coming in from the north made her stomach drop. She needed a plan, and fast. Minutes felt like hours, but Rachel's team didn't back down. Every soldier, every movement was in sync. The rogue group was weakening. But just as Rachel thought they might have a chance to finish this, the front door of the cabin exploded outward. Max and Buddy rushed out, their eyes wild. Rachel froze, her heart in her throat. "Get them back inside," she shouted. But Buddy, with his deep, instinctive bond to Max, didn't listen. He growled, positioning himself between Rachel and the enemy. "Buddy, no!" Rachel yelled, but it was too late. The rogue soldiers, realizing they were outnumbered, began to retreat. But not before one of them raised his weapon toward Buddy and Max. Without thinking, Rachel grabbed her rifle and fired. The soldier dropped. Buddy turned, looking at her with those deep, soulful eyes, as if to say, "I trust you." And in that moment, Rachel understood. Buddy wasn't just protecting Max. He was protecting her. He had been her guardian since the moment they met. He had been more than just a dog. He had been a soldier, too. The remaining rogue soldiers retreated into the woods, their shots fading into the distance. Rachel collapsed against a tree, the adrenaline leaving her body in waves. She had done it. They had done it. Max and Buddy ran to her side, their tails wagging, but they were both exhausted, scared. Rachel wiped the blood from her face, her body still trembling from the fight. "It's over," she whispered. Looking at Buddy and Max, "You're safe now." Buddy laid down beside her, his head resting on her lap, and Max curled up next to him. For the first time in what felt like forever, Rachel allowed herself to breathe. They had survived. Together. And no matter what came next, Rachel knew one thing. She would protect them no matter the cost. The woods were eerily quiet after the gunfire had died down, the smoke of the firefight hanging in the air like a heavy fog. Rachel sat in the dirt, her back against the cold bark of a tree, her body exhausted but her mind running a mile a minute. She had been through countless operations, been under fire more times than she could count. But this felt different. This wasn't about a mission, about following orders. This was about loyalty. This was about family. She looked down at Max, still curled up next to Buddy, their bodies exhausted but their eyes alert. They had been through so much, but Rachel could see the trust in their eyes, the same trust they had given her from the moment she had found them. Buddy, ever the protector, had not left her side, even as the battle raged around them. Max, the small, terrified puppy she had rescued, had turned into something else, something brave, something capable. Rachel could feel the bond between them strengthening with every passing moment. They had been through hell together, but now they were together on the other side of the fight. "Thank you," Rachel whispered, her voice hoarse from the adrenaline and the effort of fighting back the pain in her leg. She reached down and petted Buddy's head, then gently scratched Max behind the ears. They were safe for now, but Rachel knew this wasn't the end. She glanced at Carter, who was standing on the other side of the camp, his face serious as he scanned the perimeter. His team had already begun the process of securing the area, ensuring there were no other rogue soldiers waiting in the wings. But Rachel knew this fight wasn't over. The rogue group would regroup, they would come back. And next time, they wouldn't be as lucky. Carter walked over to her, his eyes softening when he saw the blood on her leg. He didn't say anything at first. He didn't need to. The weight of the situation hung in the air between them. "You did good," Carter said finally, his voice rough. "We all did." Rachel shook her head, her thoughts still spinning. "It's not over. They'll come back. We're not done yet." Carter sighed, looking at her wound. "You need to get that looked at. We're not going to do anyone any good if you bleed out." Rachel smiled weakly, despite the ache in her chest. "I'm fine, Carter. I can't afford to be down right now." "Rachel," Carter said firmly, kneeling next to her, "you need to rest. Let us take care of the perimeter. We'll keep watch." She didn't want to admit it, but he was right. Her leg was throbbing, and the adrenaline was wearing off, leaving her exhausted. She nodded and allowed herself to lean back against the tree, feeling the weight of everything catch up with her. Carter gave her a long look before standing up. "I'll have Dawson check it out. Get some rest. We'll figure out what's next once we're sure the area is secure." Rachel leaned back, her eyes closing as she tried to relax for the first time since the chaos had begun. Max and Buddy snuggled closer to her, their warmth a comforting reminder of why she couldn't stop now. She had promised them safety, and she wasn't going to break that promise. Not for anything. Later that night, after Rachel had been patched up and the team had secured the camp, they gathered around the fire. The crackling flames were a small comfort in the dark, the embers casting long shadows on the trees around them. Max and Buddy lay by the fire, their bodies exhausted but finally at peace. Carter sat across from Rachel, his face shadowed in the firelight. "We need to get them out of here," he said, his voice low. "They're not safe here. Not with the rogue group still out there." Rachel nodded, her thoughts already racing ahead. They couldn't stay in the woods forever. But where could they go? Where could Max and Buddy be safe from the people who had trained them, used them, and now hunted them? "We'll keep moving," Rachel said, her voice steady but filled with uncertainty. "I've got a contact up north, someone who might be able to help. But it's a long shot. We'll have to lay low, keep off the grid." Carter raised an eyebrow. "You sure you want to involve someone else? We don't know who we can trust anymore." "I don't have a choice," Rachel replied, her eyes hardening. "Max and Buddy deserve a chance at a normal life. We owe them that." Carter didn't argue. He understood. They both did. They were in this together. The next day, Rachel and her team packed up quickly, making sure they didn't leave any trace behind. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The rogue group would be out there, looking for them. Rachel knew they had to keep moving. The clock was ticking. As they made their way through the dense forest, Rachel couldn't help but glance over at Buddy and Max. The two dogs were walking beside her, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, alert and ready for whatever came next. But there was a quiet peace between them, a bond. And Rachel realized that she wasn't just protecting them. They were protecting her, too. After hours of walking, they finally reached a secluded cabin in the hills, the place Rachel had arranged for them to lay low for a while. It was isolated, off the beaten path, and the kind of place that would blend into the landscape. But Rachel knew that no matter how hidden they were, the rogue group would still come. They'd never stop hunting them. Rachel stepped inside the cabin, checking the rooms and making sure everything was secure. The place was small, but it was sturdy, with thick walls that would hold up against anything short of an assault. "This will do for now," Rachel said, her voice firm as she surveyed the surroundings. Carter looked around, satisfied with the location. "It'll work. We just need to make sure we're ready when they come." Rachel nodded. "We will be." That night, as they settled in and made the place feel more like home, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling of dread that still lingered in her gut. The rogue group wasn't just some faceless enemy. They were after Max and Buddy because they had been part of something much bigger. Something dangerous. Something Rachel didn't fully understand yet. But she would find out. She would find out everything. And when she did, she would make sure no one would ever harm Max and Buddy again. The battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. The cabin was quiet that night. Rachel sat by the fire, watching the flames dance in the dim light, her mind racing with thoughts she couldn't shake. Max and Buddy were curled up on the rug nearby, exhausted from the long journey and the terrifying encounters that had followed them. Their bodies were still, but their eyes occasionally flicked toward her, as though they too were waiting for something to happen. Rachel couldn't rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flash of gunfire, heard the crackling of branches as the rogue group moved through the woods. They were closing in. She knew that much, but there was something bigger at play here. Something more than just a group of rogue soldiers. Max and Buddy weren't just dogs. They were part of something more dangerous than Rachel had ever anticipated. The symbols, the training, the fear in their eyes, it wasn't just instinct. It was something they had learned, something they had been forced to endure. Rachel stood up abruptly, the floor creaking under her boots. She couldn't sit here any longer. She had to do something. She had to find out more. The feeling gnawed at her insides, and she knew she couldn't let this go. Not until she understood everything. She walked over to the corner of the cabin, where a small wooden desk sat, cluttered with papers and maps. Carter had left it behind when he made the perimeter rounds. She sat down and began sorting through the documents, searching for something. Anything that would give her a lead. There were mission reports, maps of the area, even some military jargon that made little sense to Rachel. She scanned them quickly, her eyes darting from one page to the next. Then one document caught her attention. It was an old report, faded and almost illegible. The date was several years ago, long before Rachel had ever crossed paths with Max and Buddy. The title read, Operation Eclipse, Covert Animal Training Program. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the answer she had been searching for. She quickly flipped through the pages, trying to make sense of the document. As she read, the pieces started to fall into place. Max and Buddy had been part of a secret military program designed to use animals, specifically dogs, for covert operations. The program was known as Operation Eclipse. The report described a series of experiments where dogs were trained to perform reconnaissance, detect explosives, and even infiltrate enemy lines. Max and Buddy weren't just trained to be soldiers. They were molded to be weapons. The report also mentioned that Operation Eclipse had been shut down after an incident, but not all the animals had been recovered. Some had escaped, and others had been abandoned, left to fend for themselves. Rachel closed the file, her mind spinning. She had known Max and Buddy were different, but she hadn't realized the full extent of what they had been through. They weren't just victims of neglect. They had been part of a military project, one that had used them as tools in a deadly game. But who was still hunting them? And why had they been abandoned? Rachel stood up from the desk, her heart racing. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Max and Buddy had been through hell. They deserved the truth. She walked over to the dogs, who were now sitting up, watching her with attentive eyes. She knelt down beside them, stroking their fur gently. "I'm going to find out everything," she whispered, her voice full of conviction. "I promise you, no more running." The next morning, the team was up early. Rachel briefed them on what she had discovered, explaining the details of Operation Eclipse. The team listened intently, but Rachel could see the concern in their eyes. This was bigger than anything they had dealt with before. "We need to move fast," Carter said, his voice steady but filled with worry. "We can't stay here much longer. If they know we have them, they'll come after us again. We need to get Max and Buddy to safety." Rachel nodded, but there was still one thing she had to do. One loose end that needed to be tied up. "We're leaving soon," she said, "but I'm going to make one last stop before we go. I need to find someone." The old contact was a retired military officer who had once worked on classified operations. Rachel had crossed paths with him during her time in the service. His name was Colonel Henry Barlow. He was a man who had seen everything, too much perhaps, and he knew the ins and outs of every secret program the government had ever tried to bury. Rachel drove with Carter and the rest of the team to a small, quiet town on the outskirts of the forest. The place was barely on the map, tucked between rolling hills and dense woods. Rachel knew Henry lived in a small house on the edge of town, far enough away to avoid attention but close enough to keep tabs on the rest of the world. They arrived at his house just as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the horizon. The house was small but well kept, a small garden out front with a few faded American flags hanging by the porch. Rachel knocked on the door, her hands steady despite the anxiety bubbling in her stomach. She hadn't seen Henry in years, and she knew that asking him for help meant pulling him into something dangerous. But she didn't have a choice. The door opened, revealing a tall man with graying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. He looked older than Rachel remembered, but there was still something familiar about him, something that reminded her of the camaraderie they had shared in the field. "Sergeant Miller," he said, his voice calm but filled with surprise. "I didn't expect to see you again. Not under these circumstances." Rachel gave him a small, tight-lipped smile. "I need your help, Henry." He looked past her, noticing Carter and the others standing behind her. His eyes narrowed. "This isn't just about a simple visit, is it?" "No," Rachel said, shaking her head. "It's about something much bigger than I thought. I need to know everything about Operation Eclipse. I need to know why Max and Buddy were abandoned." Barlow stepped back, allowing them into the house. He didn't say anything at first, just motioned for them to sit at the kitchen table. Rachel could see the gears turning in his mind, the hesitation before he spoke. "I worked on Operation Eclipse," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "I knew what they were doing, but I didn't realize just how far they were willing to go. Max and Buddy were part of it. They were supposed to be the best. But when the operation ended, the higher-ups decided it was easier to clean up the mess than deal with the fallout. They abandoned the animals, left them to fend for themselves." Rachel felt a wave of anger surge through her. Why? Why didn't anyone stop them? Barlow's eyes softened, filled with regret. Because sometimes, in these programs, the people in charge don't care about the cost. They just want results. The rest doesn't matter. Rachel swallowed hard, trying to keep her voice steady. "And now they're after them. The rogue group. Do you know who they are?" Barlow nodded slowly, his face grim. "I can't tell you everything, Rachel, but I know they're former operatives. They were part of the program. When it shut down, they went rogue, and now they're hunting down the animals who escaped. They want to finish what was started. They're not going to stop until they get them back." Rachel clenched her fists. She wasn't going to let that happen. Not to Max. Not to Buddy. "Where do we go from here?" Carter asked, breaking the silence. Barlow's gaze flicked over to the window, as if weighing his next words carefully. "You need to leave. You need to get out of the country. The rogue group has resources, and they'll come after you if they know you're still in the area." Rachel stood up, her resolve hardening. "We're not running anymore," she said firmly. "We're staying and fighting. We're going to make sure they never hurt these dogs again." Barlow studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Then you'd better be ready. This won't be easy. But if you're in this, you have to be all in. There's no turning back." Rachel looked at Max and Buddy, their eyes filled with trust, and nodded. "I'm all in," she said. The days that followed were a blur of movement, decisions made on the fly, and preparations for what Rachel knew would be their final stand. The rogue group was closing in. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach. The trail they had left behind was too easy to follow, too obvious. She had hoped that the secluded cabin would give them the time they needed to regroup, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized it wasn't just about hiding. They couldn't keep running. This was the endgame. The rogue group had to be stopped once and for all. Rachel sat in the dim light of the small cabin, her gaze fixed on the map spread out before her. Her fingers traced the lines, mapping out possible escape routes, defensive positions. But all of it seemed futile. The group was too well organized, too persistent. They wouldn't just give up. Max and Buddy sat beside her, their eyes constantly scanning the room, still alert, still watching. They had become more than just her companions. They were her partners in this fight. She could see it now. The bond between them had grown into something unbreakable. The dogs weren't just survivors, they were warriors in their own right. She glanced at Buddy, who was sitting still, his posture rigid. The older retriever was a silent sentinel, always ready. Max, on the other hand, was still young, his movements quicker, more agile, but no less committed. She had come to trust them with her life, and she knew they were trusting her, too. Carter's getting the perimeter set, Rachel muttered to herself, still running through the plan in her mind. We'll hold here as long as we can, but we need to hit them hard. We don't have the numbers to win in a prolonged fight. Buddy let out a low growl, his ears pricked. Rachel looked up, and for a moment their eyes met. There was an unspoken understanding between them. Buddy was ready. Max, though, whimpered softly, his small body tense. Rachel reached out and scratched behind his ears, trying to comfort him. "It's going to be okay, Max," she said softly. "You've already been through so much. We're not going to let anyone hurt you again." The door creaked open, and Carter stepped inside, his face grim. "They're close. Very close. We've got maybe an hour before they're here. I've got men watching from the east and west, but they'll breach us soon enough." Rachel nodded, pushing herself up from the table. "We're not running. This ends today." Carter looked at her, his eyes filled with concern. "Rachel!" "No!" She cut him off, her voice hard. "We've come too far. We have to stand our ground. Max and Buddy deserve that. We deserve that." Carter didn't argue, though he clearly didn't like the plan. Instead, he nodded, giving her a brief, understanding look. "All right, I'll set the traps. You and the dogs stay close." Rachel turned to Max and Buddy, who had already risen to their feet, alert and ready. "Stay close," she whispered to them. "We're going to need you." The battle began in the early morning, just as the sun began to creep over the horizon. The team had prepared for the worst, setting up makeshift barricades and traps around the cabin. Rachel's mind was sharp, focused on the task at hand, but there was an undercurrent of fear that ran through her. Not for herself, but for the dogs. Max was still just a puppy, no matter how brave he seemed, and Buddy, though battle-hardened, wasn't invincible. But there was no time for fear. They had made their stand. The rogue group was here, and Rachel wasn't going to let them take what she had fought so hard to protect. The first wave hit hard. Gunfire erupted in the distance, and the roar of shouting voices filled the air. The team fired back, returning shots, but Rachel knew this was just the beginning. They were outnumbered, and they couldn't hold the perimeter forever. Through the chaos, Rachel could hear Max's bark, sharp and urgent. She turned to see him darting towards the window, his eyes wide, his body tense. He wasn't barking out of fear, he was barking to warn them. "Get down!" Rachel shouted, diving toward the floor as bullets whizzed past her, narrowly missing her. She crawled across the room to Max, who was standing at the window, staring outside. "They're already inside," Carter's voice crackled through her earpiece. "Get ready. They're coming in from the north." Rachel gritted her teeth, holding her breath as she adjusted her weapon. "Hold your positions. Don't let them get in." But the moment they stepped inside, all hell broke loose. The rogue group was relentless. They knew the layout of the cabin, knew the terrain. They were prepared for this. Rachel and her team fought back as best they could, but it was clear that this was a fight for survival. The team was holding their ground, but the enemy was pushing them back with every move. Buddy was the first to charge, his growl vibrating through the cabin. He tackled one of the soldiers to the ground, knocking him out cold. Max, seeing Buddy in action, followed suit, leaping at another enemy soldier and biting down on his arm with a force that surprised even Rachel. Max wasn't just a puppy anymore. He was a fighter. Rachel fired from the corner, taking down another soldier. The fight was chaotic, each moment stretching on forever. It was a blur of gunfire, shouting, and the sounds of fists connecting with flesh. Then, through the smoke and chaos, Rachel saw the leader of the rogue group, the man who had been leading the hunt for Max and Buddy. His face was twisted with rage, and he held a gun aimed directly at her. "End of the line, Sergeant," he sneered, stepping closer. But before he could pull the trigger, a loud growl erupted from behind him. Buddy launched himself at the man, knocking him to the ground with a vicious snarl. The gun skidded across the floor, and Rachel seized the opportunity. She dashed forward, knocking the man out with one swift blow to his temple. He collapsed unconscious to the floor. The fight had taken its toll. The cabin was a mess of broken furniture, blood, and smoke. But Rachel wasn't done yet. She stood tall, her heart still pounding in her chest, her eyes scanning the room for any remaining threats. The last of the rogue group was taken down quickly. Their leader had been unconscious, and the remaining soldiers either fled or surrendered. The battle was over. But Rachel wasn't sure if the danger was truly behind them. They had won this fight, but the truth about what had happened to Max and Buddy, about the dark forces hunting them, was far from over. Later that night, as the team tended to their wounds and began packing up to move out, Rachel found herself sitting alone outside the cabin, staring at the stars. Max and Buddy lay beside her, their heads resting on her lap. It was a rare moment of peace, a moment she knew wouldn't last long. They had fought for survival. They had fought for each other. And now they had won. But the world they were in, the world that had trained them, used them, abandoned them, wasn't a place where peace came easily. Rachel closed her eyes, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. She didn't know where the road would take them next, but she knew one thing for sure. She would keep fighting. For Max. For Buddy. For the family they had become. This battle was over, but the fight for their future had just begun. Thank you to my amazing family for staying with me until the end of this story. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoyed this journey, I just know you'll love what comes next. I've prepared something even more exciting and surprising that I can't wait to share with you. Just click on the end card appearing on your screen right now to watch the next one.